It seems pretty simple. You walk into an ice cream shop and you decide on chocolate. Good choice. You can't go wrong with chocolate. But you had many flavors to choose from, and you chose chocolate, even though several other flavors looked very yummy. So you decided what you wanted and you acted on that choice. Case closed. This proves that we have free will. Or does it? Greetings, my name is Science-Hansten, and today we will discuss the free will conundrum. This is a question that has stumped humanity for thousands of years, actually. In the West, it started about 2,500 years ago with the Greek atomists Democritus, Leucippus, and later Epicurus and Lucretius. So we will focus on the free will skepticism and also why I have the end of hate in the subtitle. That's a pretty bold claim, and we will get to that. I thought it might be useful for me to explain why I'm so interested in this topic. The beginning of me was my discussion with a cardiologist friend in 1972. I still remember the moment. After graduating from UCSF, I was working at Stanford Medical School on some drug interaction research, and I was chatting with a cardiologist friend after dinner. And he actually looked a little bit like this stock image. But I brought up something I'd been pondering for a while, and I asked him, have you ever wondered how we can make free choices given that we are part of the natural world and everything that happens is in a causal chain of events that is subject to universal scientific laws? Now, he was a smart guy, but he couldn't see the problem. So I thought maybe it was me, maybe it was a dumb question. So the next 20 years were my dark ages. I read various articles on free will, but most of them were a waste of time. And I was busy with my drug interaction research and writing, so I didn't have time to really pursue it. But then in the mid-1990s came the epiphany. I read Descartes' Error and by Antonio Damasio, and it's this book here. It was transformative. It was then I realized that we not only had a theoretical problem of the causal chain of events subject to scientific laws, but we have a very real practical problem based on the functioning of the brain. Now, I'd heard of Phineas Gage in the past, but Damasio's description, along with his discussion of his own patients who had similar prefrontal cortex damage, made all of this very real. So this caused a paradigm shift for me. All of a sudden, I realized that I had softened my attitude towards difficult people. Just one example, a person I knew who caused so much pain to the people around him behaved just like the people Damasio described who had prefrontal cortex damage. So this guy's behavior became much less irritating to me. My initial reaction was still anger, of course, but I was able to move on to having a degree of compassion towards him to mix in with the negative feelings. And this actually does help. As Damasio said, it seemed that for these people, their free will is compromised. And this is liberating. You don't have to spend so much time loathing nasty people or having negative feelings. You still have to do what you can do to counter the bad outcomes from their behavior, of course, but being less angry means you can focus on that better. Now, I'm not claiming it's a panacea, but it actually does make life somewhat easier when dealing with obnoxious people. And here's the great part. Even if I'm wrong, I don't think I am, but even if I am, if I'm suffering from the illusion that free will is an illusion, it still makes my life and those with whom I interact just a bit better. So if that is what's happening, it's what Friedrich Nietzsche called useful error. So this rekindled my interest in free will, but over the next 30 years, I continued to search in vain for cogent arguments to support free will that were consistent with scientific principles. I read countless articles in scholarly journals. I read anthologies such as this book on free will. It had a number of different authors, pro and con, on free will. And some of these were very good, but and I also watched a series of 24 lectures by Sean Nichols from the University of Arizona, great philosophical debates, free will and determinism. And again, they were interesting, but still no solution. Actually, one of the few rays of hope came from Friedrich Nietzsche, who I'd become addicted to by this time. I had 2.5 hours a day on the ferry and bus going to University of Washington, and I spent a lot of time studying Nietzsche. And he just nailed the free will problem. He was a philosopher, but he described the critical role that science played in the free will debate. He talked about free will throughout his works, but most of the quotes you'll see later came from Human All Too Human, one of his earlier works. I also have another version of this by a different translator that's a little more extensive. Then I started to read other philosophers such as Spinoza, Schopenhauer, Bertrand Russell, and I can see that Nietzsche wasn't alone in his free will skepticism. Interestingly, all of those philosophers felt science was critical to understanding the world. And they all spent considerable time studying science and seemed to understand how science is done. Both Nietzsche and Schopenhauer seriously considered a career in science, as a matter of fact. Then I ran across many people in physics and biology who pointed out that free will is completely inconsistent with scientific principles. As you will see in a moment, free will was denied by the likes of Albert Einstein, Charles Darwin, Francis Crick, co-discoverer of DNA, along with James Watson and Rosalind Franklin, who gets no credit, even though she was critical to the discovery. And also in 2003, I started teaching a class on philosophy of science at University of Washington, a class I'm still teaching, by the way. I included the free will debate in one of the lectures every year. But all this came to a head in 2024 when I heard that Professor Robert Sapolsky from Stanford was coming out with a book, Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will. And that is right here. So I got my hopes up, and I was not disappointed. I pre-ordered it, and while I was waiting to read Determined, I read another book by Professor Sapolsky by the name of Behave, which was also a watershed moment for me. An amazing book, and it made an excellent prequel to reading Determined later. So my 50-year wait was worth it. In a way, Sapolsky vindicated Nietzsche's argument that as science progressed, free will would become less and less viable. But in Nietzsche's day, the science wasn't there. Nietzsche's was a work of genius, but he was extrapolating. Now, Professor Sapolsky and, of course, his fellow neuroscientists provided the science that supported Nietzsche's claim. Determined is, in my view, the best discussion ever written on free will. And it's written also in a very engaging style, yet he doesn't sacrifice rigor in doing that. So let's look at a question that we have to address. Why do people think free will is a self-evident fact? Many people do. And I think that it's because everyone experiences a lifetime of forming intentions and acting on those intentions. And of course, the question is, doesn't that prove free will? I intend to have a cup of coffee in the morning, and pretty soon I'm drinking a cup of coffee. Doesn't that prove that free will exists? So we all come to the debate, excuse me, with an almost irresistible psychological bias that we freely choose to do or not do certain things. So we form an intent and we act on that intent. It seems pretty simple. And I don't think anybody would disagree with this portion of it. Intent leads to action. This is clear. And they say, well, it's the end of the story. We have free will. But the problem is, it starts to get sticky when you ask where the intent actually comes from. This is a very important question, and one that oftentimes people don't address. And I mean specifically, not just, well, the intent comes from my free will. Where does it come from specifically? Saying it comes from your free will explains nothing. It's a circular argument. But perhaps we could all agree that our intentions come from our proclivities and our likes and dislikes. So a credible answer to this question, where does the intent come from, is needed to justify free will. So what about those proclivities? Let's say that you go into an ice cream shop and somebody offers you 3 cones. You can pick whichever one you want. Which one of the cones do you choose? Well, there's only one wrong answer, the vanilla. There's no excuse for vanilla ice cream. So I would pick one of the chocolates, and but the problem is I don't have the faintest idea why I prefer chocolate. I prefer it to vanilla, but why do I prefer chocolate? Did I choose to like chocolate better, or is it due to factors unknown to me? I don't have the faintest idea. It's just the way I am. But wait a minute. What if someone told you the vanilla cone had poison added? Then even if you love vanilla, you wouldn't pick it. But this is also just the way you are, in that you don't want to die from eating poison. So it doesn't affect the free will issue at all. And as an aside, for some foods we do know, like cilantro, where a genetic variation in olfactory receptor genes, OR6A2, and if you're interested, causes aldehydes in cilantro to taste soapy. So every now and then we do have an identifiable reason, but for the vast majority of cases, people have no idea why they prefer one thing over another. So here's another example. In every relationship, there's one person who loads the dishwasher like a Scandinavian architect and one who loads it like a raccoon on crystal meth. Now, this is true in our household, but there's a serious question here. How did I become the kind of person who would load the dishwasher like a Scandinavian architect, and how did my dear wife, Ruth, become a raccoon on crystal meth? She's cuter than that guy, I want to point out, but there are clearly specific reasons for our differing behavior, but neither one of us would be able to identify these reasons precisely. We might think we know the reasons, how our parents loaded their dishwasher. No, neither of our parents had dishwashers. We were the dishwashers. But in any case, I didn't choose to have this Scandinavian architect proclivity. It just happened to me, probably from causality that was distributed amongst many factors: my genetics, my neurophysiology, parenting, et cetera, et cetera. And even if I were to identify a likely cause, it would be something outside of me that caused it. So I'd like to address now something that I know this whole topic freaks people out. So if somebody says, do I have to give up my belief in free will? And I would respond, no. All you need is to understand that free will is becoming more and more difficult to support given advances in neuroscience and physics. And also, there are enormous personal benefits to giving up free will, as we will discuss later, and benefits to society as well. So you don't have to, but I think recognizing that it's very controversial and it's losing ground as time goes on, the free will hypothesis. So I'll give you a 2-minute history or less of the free will debate. Epicurus learned from the atomists such as Democritus and Leucippus, and the Roman Lucretius later wrote down Epicurus's ideas. I prefer I have the poetry version as well, but I prefer the prose version. This is an absolutely remarkable book. I don't know why I only read it like 5 or 6 years ago. Unbelievable, and they came up with atomic theory, an early theory of evolution, sense perception, incredible numbers of things that they came up with by observing the world. They didn't just pop out of their heads. So the problem was that they struggled to be able to have an atomic theory and also be able to say humans have free will. So they came up with a fudge factor that was pretty interesting, the swerve, which we can't get into now, but it's a very interesting way of trying to get around determinism. St. Augustine talked about it mainly from a theological standpoint, that if God knows what's going to happen, then we are forced to follow whatever God knew was going to happen. Boethius also, and this is a book also worth reading still today. He also addressed this God foreknowledge thing and free will, but he talks about a lot of other stuff about the importance of, well, the title of it is The Consolation of Philosophy. which it actually does show the ways in which a philosophical orientation can allow you to get through really difficult times. And in his case, he was executed after a while. Montaigne, who along with Nietzsche, my the person I'm most interested in reading, as you can see here, I have lots of little notes to him. Incredible book. And Montaigne did talk about this problem before Descartes did, by the way. He didn't talk about free will much, but he talked about it with regard to how an immaterial soul or mind can impact the material body. And he wondered what that connection might be, which is exactly what Descartes and Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia were discussing. They had dozens of letters, which you can still get online, dozens of letters that went back and forth for 2 or 3 years. And Descartes' position was that matter and mind are separate, dualism, not too popular today, and he said our free will comes from our immaterial mind acting on our material body. Now, in her response, Princess Elizabeth profusely praises Descartes and apologizes for her abject stupidity and her errors. She said, quote, "Your goodness shows not only in your pointing and correcting the faults in my reasoning, but also in your using false praise. I am so ashamed to admit that I have found in myself all the causes of error that you mention in your letter, and that I can't yet banish them entirely." And then it's really wonderful to read these things, because then she pulled her very best Peter Falk Columbo impersonation, and she says, in essence, "But I just can't help wondering," and then she proceeds to totally dismantle his arguments. So she said, "I've never been able to conceive of what is immaterial in any way except as what is not material." Pretty sensible statement. And that can't enter into causal relations with matter. So I think Princess Elizabeth won this debate. Now the debate continues among neuroscientists, other biologists, theoretical physicists, computer scientists, philosophers, legal scholars, everybody. And some of these disciplines, especially theoretical physics, a substantial percentage of the people are skeptical about free will. So speaking of physics, let's just look at a very simplified version of it. Everything that happens has a cause and is subject to the same universal physical laws. So that doesn't really leave much room for a free will to enter in. And one of the earliest people who talked about this was a French mathematician, Laplace, Marquis de Laplace. And he argued that a superintelligent being, he said like a demon, who knew all the physical facts about the world at a given moment could apply Newton's laws to predict precisely what would happen in the future. Now, computer science philosopher Bernardo Kastrup, who you will hear from shortly, says prediction is actually impossible both in practice and in principle for computational reasons. But we don't have to deal with that now. But in any case, he thought that you could, in fact, predict what would happen. Now, for me, the only thing demonic about Laplace were his Laplace transforms. Our pharmacokinetics professors, when I was at UCSF, they loved Laplace transforms. We students, on the other hand, didn't love them. We were told they were a method for solving linear differential equations, but only the suck-ups in the front row with their undergraduate degrees in mathematics understood what was going on. And here's a rather well-known physicist who didn't beat around the bush. Albert Einstein said, "I do not believe in free will, period." And he went on to say, "I do not believe in free will. Schopenhauer's words, 'Man can do what he wants, but he cannot will what he wills,' accompany me in all the situations throughout my life and reconcile me with the actions of others, even if they are rather painful to me. This awareness of the lack of free will keeps me from taking myself and my fellow men too seriously as acting and deciding individuals and from losing my temper." Now, he said something very similar in another essay around the same time titled "The World as I See It," which I'll show you at the end. So both of these things, this one is my credo and the other one is the world as I see it. The lack of free will was a very important concept for Einstein because he brought it up in both of these summaries of his worldview. Einstein obviously believed his lack of belief in free will was an important feature in his life. And in both essays, he made clear the advantages that free will skepticism had for living in the world. So, and that's, I think, an important part of this whole discussion. So Einstein's on board. So are a lot of other physicists. Brian Greene has also talked about free will a lot. Free will is the sensation of making a choice. The sensation is real, but the choice seems illusory. Laws of physics determine the future. And his ability to apply this to his life is shown in the next quote, which is really quite amazing. If I write a good sentence or solve an equation, I don't take credit for it in the way we usually think about it. I say to myself, hey, particles, nice job. I'm really pleased that the forces came together to yield that outcome. I'm not joking. This is how I really think about how we fit into the world. And like Einstein, he applies free will skepticism to his everyday life. And Brian Greene also shows how valuable free will skepticism is for avoiding arrogance and not taking oneself too seriously. And Einstein mentioned that as well. Another theoretical physicist weighs in, and she doesn't mince words. I think free will is logically incoherent nonsense. Throwing out determinism because you don't like it its consequences is really bad science. And she even came up with a formula that proves free will is false, shown here. Now, I'll take her word for it. I haven't the faintest idea what that means. But many other physicists are free will skeptics as well, Lawrence Krauss and many others. Now, another person who is physics adjacent, a brilliant person who believes free will is an illusion, Bernardo Kastrup, I mentioned him already. He has a PhD in computer science and worked in artificial intelligence and did scientific work at CERN in Europe and other institutions. But he also got a PhD in philosophy, and he's combined philosophy with his computer science and scientific knowledge. And he says, our choices are a function of what we are, and we cannot not be what we are. We don't choose who we fall in love with. We don't choose what we like to do and what we don't like to do. Do you choose your next thought? Which is a good question. Do you choose your emotions? If you did, you would never feel angry, depressed, or anxious. Now, I shortened this a little bit so I could fit it on the slide, but his reasons for not believing in free will are different from most physicists. He has a different take on it, actually different than biologists or philosophers. But we don't have time to go into his compelling arguments. I think they're very compelling, his arguments against free will. But it's from a totally different angle that he claims that we don't have it. Biology also. Stunning advances in neuroscience are explaining more and more about the origins of human behavior. And again, Nietzsche knew this. He saw where this was headed 150 years ago. He said, even if the inherited habit of erroneous esteeming and hating continues to govern us, it will grow weaker under the influence of growing knowledge. And here he was talking about scientific knowledge. Nietzsche had a habit of being ahead of his time, and I think this is another example. Now, neuroscientists like Dr. Sapolsky have proven Nietzsche right. I mentioned this book earlier. In an interview, he said he thought this book would convince people of the biological origins of their behavior, but unfortunately, the free will debate continued despite this book. Now, we're all subject to the same myriad of influences on our behavior over which we have no control at all. And I condensed this book, and it's about, I don't know how many pages, 700 or 800 pages, into a single slide. So you know this is a dumb thing to do, but here it is, human behavior in the center, and then all of these things that can affect it. So when you behave in a certain way, your action is usually a result of many influences. And keep in mind, this slide is not complete. I ran out of room a long time ago and couldn't add anything more to the slide, but many more things could be added. And also important to keep in mind, another variable here is that these factors can be present, many of them can be present in varying degrees, such as child abuse. It can vary anywhere from being minor to life-threatening and everywhere in between. So even though I have one thing listed there, it's highly variable in degree. And the causes that I mentioned already are usually multiple. So we have distributed causality most of the time. Now, some people do have a catastrophic event, like Phineas Gage had a iron bar go through take out his frontal lobes, or people with car accidents where their frontal lobes are gone, or a tumor on the amygdala, or there's all sorts of things that could happen. But usually there isn't one of those catastrophic causes, and usually the causes are multiple and distributed over the entire life of the person, going anywhere from a few seconds before their action all the way back to when they were a fetus, and even what their ancestors did can have a role to play, as Professor Sapolsky has pointed out. So between them, these two books represent, I think, the most compelling argument that one could possibly have against free will. So in Behave, Professor Sapolsky knocked down the edifice of the false claim that the origins of human behavior are simple and that we decide what we want to do. And he actually looks a little bit like this guy. I don't know if he has abs like that, but he has the long hair like that guy. And then in Determined, when he saw that Behave didn't do it, he went through all of the arguments that were still there. So free will was hanging onto a ledge by its fingertips, and he pried them off one by one. Chaos theory, that doesn't work. Quantum mechanics, even worse. Emergence, which showed promise, but that doesn't work either. And then, of course, the old standby, it's obvious we have free will. That one hardly deserves an answer. Now, Neil deGrasse Tyson is on board with no free will. He interviewed Professor Sapolsky along with comedian Chuck Nice, who's not only funny, but he's very insightful and smart. Chuck Nice fits my stereotype that comedians are some of the smartest people around. But when Professor Sapolsky said it might be centuries to see the societal benefits of free will denial, Tyson responded, "I would like to believe that the depths of compassion that a society without free will promotes would come to us sooner than that." And then, holding up a copy of Determined by Sapolsky, Tyson said, "This book, oh my gosh, some people write a book just to write a book. This one has the power to shift the center mass of civilization." And I think you could make an argument for that if everybody got on board. It really would. So here's another guy you may have heard of, Charles Darwin, and he's on board. He said the general delusion about free will, he called it a delusion, is obvious. Criminals should suffer consequences solely to deter others rather than blaming and punishing. And he didn't say this, but also to protect society if they're violent, of course. This view should teach one profound humility. One deserves no credit for anything, nor ought one to blame others. This fits with Professor Sapolsky's comments, many of them. Whenever he talks about this, he brings this issue up, and Nietzsche did. It's an important concept. It's not just praise, but also blame. Jerry Coyne has a PhD in biology from Harvard. He's a professor at the University of Chicago, and he said the debate about free will, long the purview of philosophers alone, has been given new life by scientists, especially neuroscientists, studying how the brain works. And what they're finding supports the idea that free will is a complete illusion. Another biologist, Professor David Eagleman from Stanford, said, "In modern science, it's difficult to find the gap into which to slip free will, the uncaused causer, because there seems to be no part of the machinery that does not follow in a causal relationship with the other parts." Here's another guy you may have heard of, Francis Crick, who along with James Watson and, as I mentioned, Rosalind Franklin, described the structure of DNA, and he said, "You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules." Historians are on board. The amazing Yuval Noah Harari, I've read several of his books, an amazing writer and a very insightful, I would even say wise human being, said even if you believe that free will is possible theoretically in some situations, you should at least acknowledge that 99% of decisions don't reflect your free will. So he's acknowledging that even if you think there might be some very rare cases where you could, the overwhelming majority of the time free will doesn't play a role. And then he goes on to say the wrong idea about free will is that I have free will, so any thought that pops into my mind, any desire I have, is my free will. It's sacred and represents something sublime. This is nonsense. Again, that word nonsense, it comes up quite a bit. British philosopher Bertrand Russell talked about this. Psychology and physiology, insofar as they bear upon the question of free will, tend to make it improbable. And another person who felt free will was improbable, if not impossible, was Arthur Koestler. He was a public intellectual with a deep knowledge of both science and philosophy. He was also a brilliant writer. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature several times. I think he should have gotten it. But after reading a book of his for my death penalty work, I read a half a dozen more of Koestler's books, as well as his biography by Michael Scammell. He's a truly amazing character. What a life he spent. But he said, from the scientific point of view, which he had, a man's actions appear indeed as strictly determined by the genes which transmit his heredity, by the functions of his glands and liver, by his upbringing and past experiences which mold his habits and thoughts, his convictions and philosophy, as the functioning of a watch is determined by its springs, wheels, and bearings. So that's a pretty strong statement that he is very skeptical about free will. There's actually more like a clock or a watch. And Friedrich Nietzsche really, in this one paragraph, outlines his feelings about free will. The causa sui, which is basically self-cause. So the self-caused idea is the best self-contradiction that has been conceived so far. It is a perversion of logic, but the extravagant pride of man has managed to entangle itself profoundly with just this nonsense. Again, that word nonsense. The desire for freedom of the will in the superlative metaphysical sense, which is the sense we're talking about, which still holds sway. The desire to bear the entire and ultimate responsibility for one's actions oneself and to absolve the world, ancestors, chance, and society involves nothing less than to be precisely this causa sui and to pull oneself up into existence by the hair out of the swamps of nothingness. So he does not think this is a very strong argument. We basically are causing ourselves. And he goes on to say, man's complete lack of responsibility for his behavior and his nature is the bitterest drop which the man of knowledge must swallow. And I apologize for the man thing, that's how they talked in those days. The deepest feeling he had offered a victim or hero was misdirected. He may no longer praise, no longer blame, for it is nonsense to praise blame and nature, to praise and blame nature and necessity. And this sounds a lot like what Darwin had to say. So just as he loves a good work of art but does not praise it because it can do nothing about itself, just as he regards a plant, so must he regard the actions of men and his own actions. He can admire their strength, beauty, abundance, but he may not find any earned merit in them. Chemical processes and the clash of elements. And then finally, to understand all of this can cause great pain, and it can for some people. But afterwards there is consolation. These pains are birth pangs. Men who are capable of that sorrow, how few they will be, and he predicted that correctly, will make the first attempt to see if mankind can transform itself. In those individuals, the sun of a new gospel is casting its first ray into the highest mountaintop of the soul. Everything is necessity. This is the new knowledge, and this knowledge itself is necessity. Nice little twist there at the end. He had to throw that in. Another philosopher who's still alive, Professor Galen Strawson, and he outlines the free will problem by saying there are powerful arguments that seem to show that we cannot be morally responsible in the ultimate way that we suppose. But these arguments keep coming up against equally powerful psychological and cultural reasons why we continue to believe that we are ultimately morally responsible. And then he lists 3 points. First, how we act at any given time depends upon the way we are. Secondly, to be ultimately responsible for our actions, we must have ultimate responsibility for the way we are. We cannot be ultimately responsible for the way we are, so we cannot be ultimately responsible for our actions in any moral sense. And this way we are thing fits with many other people who have talked about free will. Because Galen Strawson is bringing up the question we asked earlier. Where do your intentions come from, and do you choose to have the intentions you do? And Arthur Schopenhauer captured this perfectly when he said, a man can surely do what he wills to do, but he cannot determine what he wills. And there's the sticky part. Now, the most common argument in favor of free will is the argument from personal incredulity. This is a fallacy, I guess an informal fallacy. If you cannot believe something is true, it must be false. So people will say, I just can't believe that humans do not have free will. So there are a lot of efforts to save free will from science. How can we still believe in free will given that all the things that occur have a cause and everything is subject to immutable laws of nature? So, as I said, I've spent several decades reading articles and books by people going through amazing intellectual contortions to try to answer this. One of the things they do is say, well, quantum theory. I can never understand why free will believers were clinging to this because it gets you nowhere. Randomness is not free will. Then they said, well, yeah, but then maybe it's chaos theory. Now, Professor Sapolsky devotes 2 chapters to chaos theory and points out that unpredictability clearly doesn't eliminate determinism. And Bernardo Kastrup talks about that a lot. I mean, they're in complete agreement with that. So Sapolsky also has 2 chapters on emergence. And initially, emergence seems to be promising, but it falls apart when you get into the details because it still requires an uncaused cause of some sort. And then finally, common sense, which really doesn't get you anywhere at all. So all the methods to try to save free will, they require that we suspend the natural laws of the universe at some point in the process. So it's kind of like this very famous cartoon by Harris. I think you should be a little more specific in step 2 here, where the person has said a miracle then occurs. So they're engaging in magical thinking, I would argue. There's no way to rescue free will from universal scientific laws and our causal links to the past without invoking magic. So what are the final thing to cover now, or what are the implications of no free will? Will we run amok? Won't it give license to people to do whatever they feel like doing? They can always say, hey, I had no choice. The evidence suggests otherwise. Let's look at the behavior of famous free will skeptics, the Marquis de Plas, Baron Dahlbach, Darwin, Nietzsche, Einstein, Francis Crick, Bertrand Russell, Brian Greene, Lawrence Krauss, Sabine Hossenfelder, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Jerry Coyne, Galen Strawson, David Eagleman, Robert Sapolsky, and even a nobody like me. Not one amok runner in the batch. And I doubt that most psychopaths and others who commit terrible deeds think they need an excuse. They just do them anyway. They don't need an excuse that they don't have free will. So running amok seems to be a pretty unlikely scenario. Here's another example. Susan Blackmore graduated from Oxford in physiology and psychology. And she also points out that you don't run amok. It's possible to live happily and morally without believing in free will. As Samuel Johnson said, all theory is against freedom of the will, all experience for it, which is true. Good point. With recent developments in the neuroscience and theories of consciousness, theory is even more against it than it was in his time, in Samuel Johnson's time. So long ago, I set about systematically changing the experience. I now have no feeling of acting with free will, although the feeling took many years to ebb away. And she basically points out that no, it's hard to do and it takes a while to get it done, but it does not cause people to run amok. Okay, what are some other implications? Well, it would engender compassion, it would reduce anger, there'd be less blaming of people for their failures, and fewer arrogant people who think they did everything themselves and they didn't have to get any help from anybody else, including luck, and reduce punitive urges also. Now, all of these things and others that I didn't have room to add here add up to peace of mind. Many people report increased peace of mind due to free will skepticism. You might think it would have the opposite effect, but in fact, this is what it tends to engender. And again, a great quote from Bernardo Kastrup. He captured this sentiment. The interview said, well, I'm not going to kick you, but if I would, you can still uphold this worldview that humans lack free will? And Kastrup replied, I live this worldview every day, and it has given me fantastic peace of mind. Like regret doesn't exist in my life. It is what it is. Now, I am part way to full Kastrup. I have way more peace of mind, not as much as he does, I'm sure, but I have way more peace of mind than before I really embraced the lack of free will. Now, one point to keep in mind before we get off of Kastrup, he is quick to point out this is not fatalistic. People can and do change based on input from other people or life events. So it's not that things can't change. People still have an impact on other people. The world can be deterministic, but that still remains true. So you shouldn't despair that anything that you do, even if what you do is deterministic, that it won't have an impact on other people. It will. So I think that's one comfort to take from this. And the other thing, and maybe one of the most important, is that when we begin to realize that humans are unlikely to have free will, we lose our capacity for hating other human beings. Now, you can still find a person's actions reprehensible, noxious, destructive, toxic, all those things. And it's not a kumbaya thing where you shower nasty people with love and say, no problem, and pat them on the back. No, you still get upset and pissed and you want to lash out. But when you've had time to reflect, and sometimes fairly quickly, you ask the question, why did they behave in this way? You start to focus on that. And this is when the free will issue becomes salient. And I can vouch for this. It really does happen. And it does make your life a bit easier when you're dealing with difficult people. So finally, I will end with possibly the best short statement ever made about free will. And it captures first the reason why it doesn't exist. And then secondly, he talks about the positive benefits. This is similar to the earlier Einstein quote, but I think this one's even better. I think it captures it even better. So he said, I do not believe we can have any freedom at all in the philosophical sense. In other words, what we normally think of as free will. For we act not only under external compulsion, but also by inner necessity. Schopenhauer saying, a man can surely do what he wills to do, but he cannot determine what he wills, impressed itself upon me in youth and has always consoled me when I have witnessed or suffered life's hardships. This conviction is a perpetual breeder of tolerance, for it does not allow us to take ourselves or others too seriously. And it makes rather for a sense of humor. And I have to say, given all the things that are happening in the world, I'm talking to you in February of 2025, given all the things that are happening in the world, this is really helpful. It really is. So that is my take on the free will conundrum and free will skepticism and the end of hate. Thank you very much for your attention.